And welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And I hope everybody's having a great February. Today we are going to be reviewing another Golden Globe winner, Poor Things, starring Emma Stone, Willem Dafoe, and Mark Ruffalo. Yeah, that actually kind of rhymes. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and let us know down in the comments below if you agree with our assessment of the movie. And if there are any movies or TV shows that you'd like us to take a look at, let us know, and we'll do our best to make that happen. Um, so Lee, how are you doing this week?
Honestly, after having to watch this movie, I don't know what to say to that question.
Well, the big game's coming up, next week, and your beloved 49ers are going to be in Las Vegas
Correct.
playing the Kansas City Chiefs.
That is correct as well. So,
So you sort
I
of get like a balance there. You get something bad with Poor Things, but you get something good with your 49ers going to the Super Bowl.
yeah, I'll wait till the end of the game to determine if it's a good or a bad thing. But yes, as far as Poor Things goes, um, this was a lot to unpack.
That's the thing, because you saw it on Sunday because you sent me a text message, and then I saw it on
Yes.
Tuesday, and I remember sitting there watching the movie with my mouth open, not in a good way, and I was just thinking to myself, "How the hell did this win 2 Golden Globes?" Because it's just it I mean, everything about it is just jarring, and it's on the nose. I mean, obviously, they're not pulling any punches when it comes to, whatever message they're trying to convey with this, and furthermore, and I only found out about this recently. This is actually based on a book from 1992, which follows the story of a mad scientist, I guess if you want to call him that, who performs this experiment that gives us Bella. Um, so without any further ado, your moviness, why don't you go ahead and take us into what is Poor Things?
Ugh, ugh, okay, so I guess the best way I could describe Poor Things, I guess, just to kind of give us an overview of the story, right? So, movie starts off with Bella, our main character, and she starts off with suicide. So that's about the first minute of the movie is watching her kill herself.
Hmm.
Um, and in essence, she washes ashore somewhere, where we have a surgeon named Godwin Baxter that finds her and does this kind of Frankenstein-esque experiment where he takes Bella and replaces her brain with that of her unborn child. Um, and then after that, that's kind of where we go through the story. So it's, I mean, kind of initially comes out as such a very weird premise. And what I find very odd is that this is known as a comedy. So if you don't get your chuckles out of suicide and having brains being implanted into people, then this is clearly not going to be the comedy for you. Um,
I mean, the comedy you describe here must be like a very, either very eclectic or ironic, really, because because in watching the movie, there really isn't anything that's objectively funny about it.
yeah, I guess a lot of, I guess, like I said, humor is always one of those things where it's hit or miss depending on what you're looking at. But yeah, I think, at least for me, right, my experience with it is that the kind of the premise is just so odd, it's really hard to get engaged with it. So, like, you have kind of this experience with Bella, and you have Bella pretty much kind of going through kind of like growing up in essence, right? So she has the physical body of a mature woman, but she has the mind of that of a child, literally. So you kind of have this type of premise, and you kind of see the interaction with everyone. So you kind of have Baxter, who was the surgeon, and I kind of view Baxter as this kind of really like protective figure. So he's like kind of there. He's always kind of looking out for her, but he's also just kind of interested in his experiment to see what it does. So he kind of plays this kind of weird role. And Baxter pretty much brings in another character, Max McCandles, who's like a medical student that works with him, and he starts to kind of meet Bella and get to know her a little bit, and he eventually falls in love with her. And this happens within the first like 20 minutes of the movie. Like, it's very fast paced. We're not skipping anything. Like, it really progresses like this.
But I was gonna say, because when I watched it, my impression was like he really didn't have any feelings for her. Like, yeah, he spent time with her because he was supposed to observe her, but I kind of felt like Godwin was kind of pushing him towards that romance. Did you get that feeling at all?
Something like that. Yeah, I could see a little bit of that. It definitely felt like that, because I guess for Baxter and his idea of having this experiment, I think there is some of that going on. So yeah, I definitely think that there was some strings being pulled. But like I said, there's takes two to tango, and for me, for the McCandless character, you know, he literally is falling in love with someone that can like struggles with like communication. Just like there's so many things that are clearly, you know, something you would expect to have a child, but you have this character falling in love with someone, and it's just so awkward. Like, it's hard to really, like, you're not supposed to take it literally, or I really hope you're not supposed to. But in that same token, as someone that's trying to enjoy and experience something, it does feel very jarring that you have kind of one of the first characters you meet falling in love with someone that is that of like a little child. And I just think that a lot of that, it's really hard to kind of get over. And I struggle with that throughout the whole film.
Right, and well, another thing too is the fact that it's like, well, at least for me, you know, Max kind of starts off as, you know, he's not entirely, you know, sure if he wants to go through with this, but as the movie develops, he kind of becomes, you know, a little bit more and more possessive, you know, with each scene, until he's like, you know, hey, you made a promise to marry me. I want you to honor that agreement. I'm sitting there, I'm like, you do realize she's got the brain of a kid, right? Like, yeah, she looks she looks like an adult, but for God's sakes, man, it's kind of like that movie 13 Going on 30. You remember that movie, Jennifer Garner, where
yes,
that's what it reminded me of, because because it doesn't matter, you know, how mature they may look on the outside, you know, if they're mentally not there, it just creates, you know, a really, really awkward situation. And not to mention the fact too that you've got Bella. Wasn't there a scene where she kind of just like stood in the dining room or somewhere, and she like peed, and the maid was like, oh, she made another wee again? Like, didn't she? Wasn't there a scene like that?
There's just, like I said, it's all just really odd to me. Like, I can't get over just how awkward a lot of the stuff is. So yeah, that happened. And it's interesting that you look at him as being like that, because initially he was like that, and I felt like as the story went on, like he was just kind of okay with her experiencing things. So it's kind of interesting, like, how you want to perceive that character, because I looked at, like, he was very initially possessive of her and wanting to do this stuff, yet, like, he kind of allows her to go on her adventure with another character, which we'll get to very brief in a moment. But he's kind of like okay with her, or kind of accepts what she's going through. And then by the end, when they kind of meet together again, I do find it kind of interesting that, like, she's like, well, you know, do you love me? He's like, you know, does it bother you that, or Bella's talk about like how, you know, she was a prostitute for a while, which I guess I'll just go out there. But like, you know, Bella's tells him, like, you know, to Max, she's like, hey, you know, is it okay that I was a prostitute, or does it bother you that that I was like this? And his response was, well, I'm only bothered by the fact that they got to spend more time with you. And I was like, I don't know what you're going for with that. I mean, I guess it's kind of like he's the one that accepts her for who she is more than anything. But I don't, like I said, it's all clouded. It's all murky. It's all whatever. But
to be fair though, like if he was willing to quote unquote accept her, you know, when she had the mind of a child, I mean, he can pretty much accept her for being a prostitute,
sure, yes, yeah.
You know.
Like I said, there's not really a very strong, there's not very likable characters in this if you look at it from a very literal standpoint.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess that is a great segue into the character Duncan, who I mean, for a lack of a better word, pretty much treats her like a sex doll.
I mean, but I will say this. I mean, did you get the feeling that that role was horribly miscast? Because I kept thinking, I mean, Mark Ruffalo is like one of the nicest guys in Hollywood. Why are you having him play a total douchebag here?
I mean, I had no problem with it. I thought he did a great job. I mean, I agree that
Yeah, I
it's
mean, he
not
did a good
really
job. I just felt like I just felt like maybe you could have gotten someone like Tom Hiddleston or Ed Skrein or someone, someone who
sure.
you believe be a bit more meta. But but that's just nitpicking on my part.
Yeah, I personally felt like, yeah, I could definitely see that with the casting. Like, he probably doesn't fit that mold of the character you'd be thinking of, but I think that he did a fantastic job. But honestly, the acting in this was great from top to bottom. Emma Stone was fantastic. I thought that it was definitely a highlight. But yeah, this character Duncan, who's pretty much like takes her, it kind of like sweeps her off her feet and takes her on this grand journey. And like I said, obviously this is a very physical relationship that they start off with, where you have Duncan and Bella getting intimate very frequently. So it kind of is, once again one of those things where it's like, oh gosh, now we've upgraded from this guy that wants to marry her, now this new person that she's, I don't want to say in a relationship with, but the new person she's kind of with now, it just kind of treats her like a sex object. And it's like, once again, when you think the fact that she's a child, it just kind of creates more and more of this struggle. And yeah, like these are the main characters that we see the most of.
Well,
And it's
let's
very, very troubling throughout.
well, I was gonna say let's back up a minute because I mean, consider like the scenes that kind of led up to her deciding to go on this steamboat sexcapade with Duncan. There were some scenes where she was like trying to, how should I word it, discover herself, and
Sure,
and and, and
yes.
they're very and
I
they were
mean, look,
very explicit, and there was that one scene where she was trying to do it to
we
the
could go.
maid. So
Yeah. I mean, we could go super granular in it, but like, there's lots of stuff that happens, right? There's a lot of self discovery that happens throughout, right?
right, but
It
right, but the
definitely is
point I'm
something.
but the point I'm getting at is that with this self discovery, it kind of makes her a bit more receptive to deciding, maybe I should go with Duncan because Duncan's more willing to let me explore a little bit further than what Max would allow,
I gotcha.
or or
Yeah,
or even or even Godwin.
yeah. No, I think because he kind of has one thing on his mind. So for Duncan's character, probably sees that as like, oh, this is a perfect opportunity for me to, get with this woman who clearly is, in your words, right, having that kind of self discovery. So yes, I definitely agree with that, and I think that kind of opens the door for that. And I think as she kind of goes on this journey with Duncan, obviously there's a lot of things that she kind of discovers. So we kind of see her starting to read and kind of do some more stuff. Like this all kind of happens on this boat sequence, which, by the way, sets are super. I don't even know how to describe the sets. Like they're extremely. Help me out. What do you think of the sets? Because I think the
So
boat is where we kind of see the original. I think that's kind of where we start to see this very interesting look at the sets.
it's got a very Wes Anderson quality to it
Oh,
in terms of the
thank
color
you.
because
Yes.
it's because the colors are very garish, right? They're not. There's nothing
Yes.
subdued about them. Another thing too is that is that when you look at the scenes that are set in like Paris or London, they're very much a callback to to those films from like from like the early 20th century. The big one that comes to mind is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because if you look at the sets on that, everything's pretty angular. It's pretty it's pretty off-putting. I guess I guess if I were to use a modern reference, there's a bit of a Tim Burton quality in terms of the set design, right? So so in terms of artistic direction, at least for me, it looked like the way that the sets were designed, they kind of match the sort of off-putting nature of the movie, in my opinion, because there are so many things about this movie that were off-putting. I felt that the set kind of complemented that vibe, you know.
Yeah, for sure. And something that's very interesting with this, the time period very much feels very Victorian, but then
Yeah.
you see parts where there's like flying airships, and you can't really put a finger on
Well,
really
it's
like.
steampunk. That's what it is.
Oh,
It's a
yeah,
steampunk
yeah,
fantasy.
exactly. It is very steampunk. It's just it's kind of interesting because it's like if I'm trying to pick a time period, I couldn't even tell you what would make the most logical sense for this because it feels archaic in some spots and then feels very futuristic in others. So it's very interesting how they kind of do that. So, but yeah, I think for Bella and where we start to see her character really, I think showing the most development is kind of this passage on the ship where she's on the ship with the character of Duncan, and it's really where she starts to experience a lot of things. Right, she starts to really get more into books, and she starts to understand the idea of religion. And when the boat is docked at this place, she sees like people suffering, and I think that's probably the only one of the only times I could think of where she showed like sadness. Right, I don't think there's any other time in this I really remember her being extremely emotional on the sad spectrum, but she was just hit so hard with the realization that she's enjoying her time on this boat and there's people out there that are suffering just the worst fates out there.
Right.
And I think this was a very big eye-opening experience for her because she started to get more in tune with how the world works. And I think by the end of the trip, she kind of starts to understand that Duncan brought her on that just for her body and not for much of anything else. So I think it kind of shows her kind of maturing and growing. Obviously, having the child's brain, you're starting to see them kind of grow up really fast or grow up in this kind of really accelerated process. So you can kind of tell a story in a normal length of a movie.
But I mean, to your
So you kind
point,
of.
but I was going to say to
Mhm.
your point too. I mean, this is also. By the way, they were in Alexandria, Egypt, but when they dock and she sees all these people suffering, it's kind of that shift from from being selfish, from just focusing on her needs, to being more attuned to the needs of others. Because
Yes.
before then, she's just more more interested in getting pounded every night by Duncan. And one could even go as far as to say they were both using each other, really. So so they were both the victims, but they were both the perpetrators at the same time. um but anyway, when she comes to that realization, it's like, once that it's kind of like, with the story of the Buddha, once he discovers that other people are suffering, there's no way to kind of go back to being a self-absorbed narcissist. But, you know, but that was just my take when I saw that scene. But
Yeah.
yeah, but back to your point, sorry.
Yeah, no. Excellent point, right? And I totally agree, right? I think this is kind of, as I said, you start to see kind of that enlightenment coming, right, for her. You start to kind of understand what's going on. She ends up giving her money away, not obviously being really gullible, not understanding that she gave her money away to a bunch of sailors that were going to give the money to the people suffering. And I put in air quotes that I know no one can see, but obviously that's not really what happened. And as they, get off of the boat, they're pretty much her and Duncan are left penniless.
Yeah,
And
because they
she
get
has to find
yeah because
ways
the
to survive.
money yeah because the money she gives away, I mean, it's technically Duncan's, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. It's Duncan's money. Yeah, it's
Okay.
Duncan's. It's Duncan's money. She actually has money set aside, which she doesn't bring up at the time being. But yes, you're right. The money that she does give away is that of Duncan. So, and this is kind of where I don't know. To me, this is the part that is the most jarring, and I realize that's kind of loaded because everything in this is jarring to me. But I think this is kind of where I don't know. I don't know if it's because like it's been so odd up to this point, it kind of tuned me out. But I felt like we just kind of went through this big lull of her being a prostitute and just like I don't know, her having sex for money, right?
But
So
she was so blasé about it too. She was like,
of
"Oh,
course, yes, and I think that's
it's like
yeah,
it's like, well, you've been doing it for free at this point, so it's just a natural
yeah.
transition to just do it for money now."
Yeah, right. She looks at it as very transactional, right? And I think this is a lot of ways that you can interpret this idea, right? So, you could easily look at it as like Bella's really finding her independence finally, right? She's really relied on men up until this point. So, Baxter kind of being, the kind of like her father that kind of created her. Max, this guy that proposes to her really quickly and is kind of just in waiting for her to come back. Duncan, kind of swooped her off her feet and took her on this, trip. So she's been very reliant on having some type of male figure in her life. This is her first moment to really kind of get autonomy, and that's, like I said, at least one of the many ways you could interpret this type of stuff. But that's kind of the way I looked at it. Was this is her finally having her autonomy to do what she wanted to, and like I said, she's able to, kind of make money. And I think she kind of starts to realize like the type of life that she wants to have through these moments. And that's kind of how I looked at it. And it seems like after a while, we find out that let's see here. Um, I think she finds out Baxter's sick, and that's what has her go back home. Right? I want to say she's being a prostitute for quite some time, and I think Baxter ends up becoming sick, so she ends up going home.
Mhm.
So she goes back home, and this is actually where we meet her ex-husband, or I guess I shouldn't say ex-husband because technically I doubt they got divorced because he didn't know what happened to her. I guess her previous husband. I don't know.
Well, I would say ex-husband because because she went from being this one person to another person.
Sure. I mean, I guess.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean,
So
technically, she is another person because she's got someone else's brain in her,
that's also a good
skull.
point.
So
That's a good point. So I don't know where you want to draw the line with that, but the person that the body of Bella was initially married to,
that's a
we
mouthful right
see.
there.
Yes, I know. Never something I would think to ever have to describe, but here we are. And you kind of see her, and it's really interesting because the guy, obviously not a great guy. The guy's a total piece of shit. And it's kind of interesting because it's like it makes you wonder the previous Bella or the one that had the adult mind, right? The
Victoria.
normal Bella that we see briefly at the start. So it
Yeah.
makes me wonder what type of person she was.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say her. I just looked it up. It was Victoria. Like she was Victoria before she became Bella.
Oh, thank you, Victoria. Yes, thank you. Okay, so when Bella was Victoria, right, we have her, and the husband is a terrible person, and it makes me kind of wonder what type of person Victoria was, and what we're missing. Was she someone that was just kind of like that? Was she also kind of someone that wasn't very nice, and maybe that played a part into her suicide? We know that the husband, Victoria's husband, states that a lot of it was that she was didn't really want the pregnancy, and I think even Bella kind of makes reference to the fact that she doesn't seem very maternal. So I think there's some interesting things in there, but it does make you really wonder for Victoria, the type of person that she was to be with a guy like that. Now, maybe there was a line that I missed where it's like, it was, did it for the money or something. I don't know. But it is very kind of curious to see her life and see how, Bella has kind of grown up in very different circumstances, obviously. But is she, a better person than her mom was? And I realize this is getting really weird now because we're talking about Bella, Victoria, which are technically two different people within the same body. So it's kind of, once again, goes to the whole muddled part of this. But in essence, we get to meet them. She ends up realizing that, hey, this guy's a real bastard and this is not the life that I want. And she ends up leaving the estate and she returns to both the dying Baxter and Max. And that's kind of how it ends with Max and Bella together with Baxter dying, and that's the end of the movie. And I realized that that's so convoluted, and like we
Yeah.
abridged a lot, but there's just we'd be here for hours going through all the absurdity that happens in this film.
I mean, it was unnecessary absurdity in my opinion because
I would agree. I'd
because
agree.
I mean
I'm on the same boat with that.
because I mean you could have started off with that weird premise of putting a baby's brain inside an adult woman, as weird as that is. I mean, yeah, I mean, but that kind of stuff isn't entirely new because I mean we can look back to the early '90s with RoboCop 2, for instance. And you could have had the story progress as it did without any additional weirdness. Because I mean, wasn't there wasn't Baxter trying to reproduce what he did with Bella with someone else?
Yes, that honestly that was something that came up, but I felt like it was so unimportant to the story I didn't even bother bringing it up. But yes, it
Yeah,
absolutely does happen,
because it
and
goes
I just
nowhere really.
it doesn't do anything. Like it's just to show that he can't recreate it because the 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 other character that they do the experiment on, like she doesn't really develop mentally at the same speed as Bella. So, like I said, she's that other character who I didn't even bother putting their name down, was probably on the screen for less than a few minutes. I just didn't even feel like it was important to even discuss because it didn't feel like it did really much for the story overall.
So, another thing I wanted to to mention too, and I never brought it up was the fact that every other scene, Emma Stone just happened to be in some weird sexual position, and I don't want to sound like a prude or anything, but I just thought to myself, are any of these scenes necessary? Because they don't really add to the story. They subtract more than they add to it, and and they really don't enhance my enjoyment of the movie. Not that I ever enjoyed it in the first place, but I just felt like
It felt like a lot.
yeah, it just felt like well, what can we put
Felt
in?
gratuitous.
Yeah, what can we do to kind of make this go by a little faster? Oh, I know. Well, how about instead of Bella doing it with another man like she normally does, she'll do it with a lady because that hasn't been done before in movies at all. And by that point, I just tuned out because I was like, all right, they're really getting carried away with this. I mean, it's just. I mean, are they really trying to make a serious drama or quote unquote comedy, or are they trying to make something that's more akin to a porno? Really?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the drama and the comedy aspect of it, I felt were very conflicting, and I think that's why, like, I can understand why there's a certain audience for this. I totally get it. There was like points where I was like, okay, I get the comedy in it. I just don't find it super funny. Like there was like one kind of joke where they're sitting at a dinner table and it's Duncan with Bella and two other people, and she like made a reference to like, oh, like something's very salty, and then she kind of made fun of like a reference to, oh, kind of like, Duncan, he's very salty.
Oh yeah,
And
I
I just,
remember that. I
yeah,
remember that.
like it's like I understood at points where they're going with the comedy. It just feels like the premise is just so icky to me. I can never get over that. I could not get beyond the fact that you have this character that really has a mind of a child. And I know that they're trying to say like, oh, well, she's excelling really quickly, but I don't think that there's a way for you to really kind of emphasize or show enough that this person is capable of making sound judgments. And,
Yeah,
and to
because
me, that's where I kind of feel like we went to this taboo area that, yes, it's certainly surreal. And there's obviously a very strong argument that you can't take it literally, which I get, right?
yeah,
It's clearly not like that. But I feel like if you want to help create this, you need to make something that doesn't feel so taboo. And I feel like they just went all in for it, and that's fine if you like that. It just wasn't for me.
yeah. It's kind of like that old saying. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. once you know that she has the mind of a child, or like literally the mind of a child, everything else that happens afterwards, even if they're saying, yeah, she's maturing at an accelerated rate, you can't get over the fact that she
Yes,
has the brain of a child. None of, I mean, I
yes.
mean, I mean, I mean, no amount of dialogue or heavy-handed virtue signaling or whatever is going to change that.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree. So, I mean, the way I look at it is, if I'm just trying to break down how, I look at this movie, one, the acting is superb, right? I know we kind of brought it up a little bit earlier, but I think the acting was really great. I think Emma
mhm.
Stone did great, especially because she talks in this very odd way, right? Like she doesn't form words and sentences very good throughout, honestly, the whole thing. And that has to take so much focus to be able to say the lines like that. I applaud Emma Stone for being able to do that because I think that just be so hard to train yourself to talk like that, because it's like, oh, you just have to read it as is, but your mind is always trying to make it make sense. So for her to kind of do that, I think Mark Ruffalo did really good. I totally agree with you. He doesn't come across as that type of character, but I think for what he did, it was really good. And like I said, even though Willem Dafoe wasn't on the screen a whole lot, he obviously does such a great job with whatever screen time that he
I mean,
had.
he made the part his own, so I'll give him
Yes,
props for that.
absolutely. Yeah, and then you got like, I thought the sets were really cool. As I said, you couldn't really figure out like where you're kind of at and what point of time it is. So kind of interesting how they do that. The costume design was really good. Like there's a lot of really strong points in this. And I think a lot of people's enjoyment of this movie is really going to go down how you kind of interpret it. And I think that's the part where everyone's going to have their own kind of lean on it, and how they kind of interpret the events that happen. For me personally, I looked at it as, a female character that really is, kind of always having this kind of male figure in their life that are, unfortunately using her for a variety of things. Not that she doesn't kind of, get a little quid pro quo in that, but I've always looked like that. And then as she's able to kind of make her own choices and she's able to kind of make her own decisions. So you kind of have her kind of getting into her own element by the end of it, where she's able to kind of make her own choice of what she wants to do. But like I said, there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. I know a lot of people have, discussed this as being like a very anti-male type of movie, where you have this, female character that's constantly being brought down by the male characters around her, which I could certainly understand that discussion. So there is a lot of very interesting elements that are in this that, depending on the viewer, you can interpret it in various ways.
I mean, did you think it was a bit on the nose when it came to trying to make men look as comically evil as possible, or as comically repressive, to kind of highlight Bella's virtues as a self-liberating woman?
Um, y- yeah, I guess they did feel very,
Because it felt very
yeah, they felt
forced. You know what I
cartoonish.
mean?
They
'Cause-
definitely felt very one-minded as
right.
far as what they wanted to get out of it. Even her, ex-husband, which I guess that's what we're just going to refer to him as, the ex-husband. But like even for him, it's like so cartoonish with how evil he is. It's like, wow, like there's no nuance at all. So I would agree. I think the characters were very plain, but I would also argue that was kind of the point, right? It's really not their story; it's Bella's. So in order to, we don't really care too much about all the male characters in this, because ultimately they're just there to kind of help, kind of push her into the direction of her having her self discovery. So yes, you could say the one note. I would argue that that was the point, and there wasn't really a reason to give them a whole lot of nuance.
Right, because if it's coming from the perspective of a child, usually children are going to see things more in a black and white sort of way than, say, adults who see more areas of gray, right?
That's awesome. Once again, great point that you could certainly look at it in a different lens as well.
Because one other thing too is the fact that when she was on that ship and she was having a discussion with that guy, like he was just being very cynical the entire time. And you wouldn't think about it, but he was another male figure who was trying to indoctrinate her in in another view of the world, because obviously Baxter's got one view, Max has another view, and then Duncan and the ex-husband, they have different views. So so you can sort of see like this sort of conflict going on in her head, where she's trying to figure out, well, which view should I really ascribe to? Because because it's at one point she's with Duncan, she's like, yeah, let's go and touch ourselves every night and let's have fun. And then the next, she's very much informed by what this guy is telling her on the ship. And then by the end of the movie, she sort of decided, I think I'm just going to live, by my own precepts, but I'm going to be married to Max. You know,
Hmm.
so I think it's safe to say that both of us didn't find this movie very appealing,
No.
at all.
No.
Compared to last week, where we gave the holdovers, glowing reviews, because we were both impressed just by the way that it was executed. To your point, individually, there were so many things about that movie that was great, like the artistic direction, the set design, um, the acting, all of that worked pretty well. But when you put it together, for whatever reason, it just didn't work. It was kind of the opposite effect of the holdovers, really.
Yeah, I think it's one, we talked about in the holdovers, right? How the story wasn't very critical to it, but it was something that at least was very grounded in, kind of our day to day stuff, right? And I think the fact that it's really grounded, it helps the audience really attach to it. When you have such a absurd premise, like in Poor Things, the premise is so absurd, so it's hard for me as an audience member, right? I'm not going to speak for everyone as an audience member, because clearly a lot of critics seem to like this, a lot of people seem to like this. So it seems to be very much like that. But I think because the story was just so absurd, and I guess that's part of the humor that they were going for, is just to make it very bizarre. But I think because of it being so off the wall, it took me out of the story. And even though there were a lot of really strong elements, our main focal point is a character that just she's hard to really be able to follow just because of her situation. So, and I think that's where my struggle was. I could never get that, because there's certainly great movies that do quote unquote the women empowerment piece, which I think do it a lot better. But I think because their stories are more grounded and it helps the audience really understand what they're going through. When you have this type of idea of a full grown adult having the child of a mind and going through this, I get from a certain standpoint, how that's gonna work, but I just can never overcome that obstacle throughout my watching. So I guess you could say that was my biggest thing with it, but it just was something that totally sucked me out of it. And like I said, I think this is one of the very few movies where normally I'll watch it twice just to kind of go through it, but I felt like once was enough, because it also felt like it just tried to do a little bit of everything. And I think that was, there was just so many different ways you could look at this. There's so many different ways you could interpret it. It just became a little bit like too much. It was just so much that they try to pack into this. And as I said, it just kind of, I think, got rid of my enjoyment of it.
So what will be your score for this movie then?
Honestly, out of 5, I would give it 2 Bella's brains out of 5. That's about all I can really say with it. It's just a little too absurd for me, and it just took me out of the movie. Even though, like you said, there's tons of accolades to go with it.
Yeah, for me, I would give it maybe 1.9 Bella's brains out of 5. Um, just because it's just trying so hard to to be something that ends up being nothing. You know what I mean? Um, this the thing that I find so odd isn't necessarily the storyline, even though the storyline is weird. It's the fact that all of these characters, they're just one dimensional. There's nothing about them that that would make you think, oh, well, there's some good qualities to it. Because even with the characters who are supposed to be benevolent, like Baxter and Max, to me they still come off as individuals who who really don't see Bella as a person. And even the character of Bella and or Victoria, there's nothing about them that makes me say, I'm really rooting for you. I really hope you're doing well, because there are just so many instances where I just thought she's just a really, really selfish person. Even when she was in Alexandria and she had that moment of realization that yes, other people are suffering. I kind of got the feeling that that she was only doing this to kind of make herself feel better about the fact
Yes.
that she was, that she was going on this luxury cruise across the Mediterranean, and she was filling her head with with knowledge. And even when she became a prostitute in Paris, it wasn't really. I mean, yes, I mean, part of it was motivated by necessity, but it was kind of self-inflicted because she didn't have to give the money away, right? She could have just kept the money and just gone on with her life and gone back to London. But I felt like a lot of the things that happened to her were self-inflicted.
Sure,
You
but
know,
I would also argue that that self-infliction comes from a child making mistakes. So,
yeah, that's
it,
true.
it's that's how I kind of looked at it as well. Because you're right, it is self-inflicted. But once again, you have to kind of quarrel with this. I think this is why we have that term. You want your cake, you want to have the cake and eat it too. It doesn't make sense to have it the way it is, just because it always felt like you can make the argument that, oh, well, she's got the mind of a child, but in that same token, we're talking about her self-discovery. And yeah, I mean, there's just, like I said,
It's a contradiction. It's inconsistent because
yeah, thank you, yes,
because if you and I know consistency is a huge thing with you, and I'll say with this because with Poor Things, it feels like Bella is doing is saying and doing one thing, but then she does the exact opposite a few scenes later, and and the big thing for me is the fact that the, is that they're trying to paint Bella as as this grandiose heroine who is discovering herself and has figured out like what the meaning of life is, but a lot of the things that she does and a lot of the events that happen around her, they're inconsequential. And I pretty much tuned out by the middle of the movie because I just felt there was really nothing of value to be offered here because there's nothing relevant whatsoever. Again, I have to refer back to the holdovers because because even though there isn't much going on in the holdovers, there's a lot more relevance to it because we could all relate to to feeling abandoned. We can all relate to trying to find our place in the world and try to find meaning within ourselves and with others. Here, it's like I mean, what's there to relate to in this movie apart from occasionally making mistakes and being selfish for the most part? I mean,
I
if
mean,
anything.
you can't relate to having your brain swap with that of your unborn child.
I can't say that I have because I don't because I've never had to make that decision with my unborn child. Um but what I was going to also say too is that you've got these two movies that are both very much character driven stories, right? It's just it's just one movie figured out how to how to do it in a perfectly balanced way, whereas the other it's just ham-fisted. It's just saying, this is what it is. You got to accept it, even though even
Yeah,
though there are numerous ways to interpret it. I feel like the way that they approached that plot was very on the nose. It's not nuanced. There's nothing to it that kind of makes you think, huh, I never thought of it that way. So that's
yeah,
my score.
yeah, it went very edgy, and I think it was a good example of, I think, like, style over substance. So
I was gonna say too. I mean, it's very much it's very much a product of its time. I.e. the modern era or postmodern era, where where people have have more of an interest in trying to say this is what's right or wrong rather than have people try to figure out for themselves. But you know, that's just our opinion here at the podcast. Um, but before we wrap up, were there any last notes you wanted to get
nope,
off your chest?
nope, no. Just that. What was the movie that we were discussing watching prior to watching this? Do you remember
Uh,
what we were discussing before?
what, the holdovers or Jawan?
No, no. So there was a movie that you had suggested beforehand, and I was like, you know what, that was such an odd movie. I don't know if I want to do that one. Do you remember?
Oh,
what movie we were-
Saltburn.
Yes, yes. So I like how we went from Saltburn, which, like I said, granted is, at least very much grounded and very odd. And I like how your comeback movie was Poor Things, and it was just it was just so much more in left field than I was expecting. So
Well, the
I
reason,
just wanna throw that out
well,
there.
the reason why is because
Totally-
I was well, my justification to that was, was because I was looking at the list of movies that had either been nominated or won Golden Globes recently,
of course,
and I was like, we should really take a look at this. So
of course,
it was purely accidental, by the way. Like I
Yes.
genuinely did not know
Okay.
that.
I thought it was so funny how that worked out, because I'm like, Saltburn's kind of weird, and then it was like Poor Things was like Hold My Beer, and it was definitely more into that range.
Oh my God. I mean, that's just the way it works here sometimes. It's like,
I know.
we'll make a suggestion. I mean, and ladies and gentlemen, this is why we ask you to put your suggestions in the comments, because if not, I'm going to keep making these ridiculous suggestions, and then we end up having to sit here wondering why the hell did we agree to this. Um, but yeah, we'll catch you on the flip side. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share these videos with everybody that you know. And thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next review. Ciao.